Welcome to episode 6 of the podcast. Today I'm going to do something I've really been looking forward to doing. I'm going to talk about state formation, specifically Nguni state formation. I'm going to provide the conceptual and structural framework to help set into context the human element. So we're going to take it from the beginning of the 18th century forward, and I will focus on the human element after this. I'll talk about Sopuza, Nguni, the fight with Zwide, how the Ingwala ceremony eventually arrives in Swaziland. But before we can do that, we need to explain an important event or process that was taking place. In the previous episode, I talked about Ngwane moving to Zombodze. And this is the period where Swazi state formation begins. But it's also the period where Ndwandwe state formation is flowering, Mthethwa state formation is flowering, Xwabe state formation, Zulu state formation. Why is this happening all in the same period? It's an interesting question. Why are states forming at the turn of the 18th century? This is a question that sparked lots of debate in the literature, and I think also produced a set of scholars that produce theories and concepts that are amazing, and we could profit from quite a lot. So I'm going to talk about the ecological theory of state formation. I'm going to talk about the trade theory of state formation. I'm going to talk about what I think of as the military, institutional, or great man theory of state formation. And then at the end, I'm going to synthesize all of these theories by basically borrowing or explaining Philip Bonner's theory of state formation, which I think provides a more comprehensive, synthetic, and frankly, a precise explanation of why so many states formed in this period. Before I do that, though, I think it's important to remind everyone about the nature of these societies so we can appreciate the dramatic transformation we see during this period. There's an excellent PhD thesis by Slater that can sometimes be a little too reductive because he sees this as the transformation from feudalism to absolutism. But I think by doing that, he sort of demonstrates how shocking and unexpected the transformation is. So let's start. These are societies that are, broadly speaking, fragmented. Authority is at the homestead level, so that you have elders who are in charge of cattle and reproduction, deciding who marries who, they're lineage based, and it's very difficult to organize labor, both for military and agricultural reasons on a massive scale. In many ways, this is why the timber accomplishment is so impressive in Mozambique, because again, people just don't have the necessary ideological frame to understand why a non-lineage member might call up labor. You simply don't have the coercive instruments as chief to launch independent wars. You don't have standing armies. So what happens to introduce this? Well, let's start with the ecological theory of state formation. The core thesis or insight here is that competition for scarce, high-quality agricultural zones led to political centralization. The story here can be explained by first appreciating that you had a small subset of regions, or even you could call them sub-regional areas, that experienced consistent rainfall, had access to watering holes, and had year-round grazing. And these particular areas were perfect for state formation. That is why it's not a coincidence that some of the major states form in Eshiselweni. This is the Ngwane or the Swazi. Then you have the Magutu Mkuze corridor with the Ndwandwe, and then sort of closer you have the Mthethwa, and then the best area is the Zulu Thornveld. So it's not a coincidence that states form there. They are sort of ecologically perfect for that sort of thing. And so these areas that you can think of as ecological miracles experience a population explosion. And one of the reasons you also see this population explosion is explained in a paper by a man named Hall. He uses dendroclimatological methods. This is where, for example, you find a tree, you chop it down, and then you look at the rings to look at how many years the tree has been around, and the size of the different rings can tell you about the rain patterns in a particular area. It's a little more complicated than this, and I will link to Hall's paper, but he sort of nicely explains how from about the year 1350 to about 1750, this area experiences consistently good rainfall. And then from the year 1750 to the year 1800, it experiences massive amounts of rainfall, so that even these areas that are sort of prime real estate experience an even greater population explosion, because the massive rainfall means you can start using millet or maize that would otherwise not be very good because the soil quality has a limit. You can start using that and then farming marginal area. And so the population or the carrying capacity of the land increases. The problem, of course, is that the population in a sort of Malthusian moment outstrips the resources of the land. This is further exacerbated because at the turn of the 18th century, you have what is called the Madlatule famine, or rather the Madlatule drought. Rainfall stops completely. And so not only do these areas no longer experience rain, but people have been using maize and millet that isn't particularly drought resistant. And they've been farming marginal areas. And so the carrying capacity of the land and the population so far outstrips each other that it's impossible. Many people would have died. And so these are sort of the dynamics in the ecological, shall we say, competition that formed in the area. And so what you end up seeing, I think this is really interesting. One of the things you see in the literature is that Zwitegalanga of the Ndwandwe is treated quite harshly. And his shall we say, focus on wars of annihilation is seen as being a product of the man's personality instead of circumstances. When you look actually at the ecological situation he was in the least advantageous zone, so that when the drought hit, his people were most affected. And so he had the greatest incentive to acquire more space, or rather, to acquire areas that were more ecologically favorable for grazing and farming. And so this is one of the ways the ecological theory of state formation explains it. It's the idea that these different areas and the ecological conditions caused people to compete for these zones. First, because of population's explosion, you want more areas so that your people can farm more, so that your cattle can graze on more area. But there's also the counter side. I'm cheating a little bit and using bonus theory, but the counter side is the idea that when the Madlatula famine hits, it is so traumatic, it causes so many deaths, that you now have competition for those few areas that at least have reliable watering holes. One of the interesting things about areas like the Zulu Thornfeld or Shiselweni is that they had rivers that even in a drought were able to be grazed because you could farm just along the riverbed. And so this is why these areas are particularly important. So that's one theory. The other theory was initially advanced by Alan Smith, and others have gone on to sort of explain it a little bit. The core thesis here is that trade in Delagoa Bay reshaped local politics. The introduction of goods or commercial goods like beads in exchange for ivory created local inequalities. These inequalities were created by the chiefs striving to monopolize trade. Of course, they never achieved it completely, but to a certain extent they did. So if you were part of the Tembe and then at one point the Inyaga, you were more wealthy than the local chiefs. It is no surprise, therefore, that the Tembe were able to absolutely dominate the region during Mangobe and Matomatoma's time. Again, you look at the conflict between the Ntetwa and the Ndwandwe. Why does this begin? It begins because Dingiswayo seeks to throw up a series of chieftaincies or a ring around the Ndwandwe and stop Zwide from trading with the Maputo. This leads Zwide to directly attack Dingiswayo. That's how important this was. But not only that, the drive for ivory led to social and institutional innovations within these chieftaincies. The system of the Amabutfo or the regiments are an outgrowth of a need to raise large amounts of labor, first to go get the ivory and then to protect your trade routes. And so you see how competition for these different trade routes leads to greater centralization. This centralization eventually leads to direct conflict. But not only that, when you get to the late stage or you get to the beginning of the 18th century, the pattern of trade in Delagope completely transforms. They no longer want ivory, but now they want foodstuff. So whalers who stop off at Delagope are looking for fresh meat. The fresh meat is cattle. And so when a chief would sell his cattle, he would need to restock his supply. And the best way to do that was to raid another chieftaincy. Again, I will make an illustrative example. It is not a coincidence that Musheshwe, the founder of the kingdom of Lesotho, made his fame as a raider of cattle, by the way. And so this is one of the explanations of state formation. There is a more sophisticated argument that you can find in the Alan Smith's papers and in other books, but this is the core thesis behind it. And then we have the third theory. Again, I've called this the military or the great man theory. I'll be quick with this theory because I think it doesn't have the explanatory depth or the sophistication of other theories. This is basically centered around the Amabutfo. The idea that the emergence of the regiments or the Amabutfo created a large group of men committed and loyal to the chief who had an incentive to follow the chief's orders because they could rise faster, and that the system of the regiment slowly whittled away the ideological commitment that these men had to their local village elders. As they served the chief and as they were rewarded in the service of the chief, they saw their advancement in the chief's advancement. And that this system, shall we say, slowly created an element of centralization and in many ways struck at the ideological underpinnings of this society. I think this is right, but I don't think it is comprehensive enough. I think it is one part of a larger piece that when put together is far more beautiful and has more explanatory power. This is where Boner comes in. And what he does really is he synthesizes and slightly tweaks all of these theories, providing, I think, the very best explanation of why are states forming in this period. Boner, in his theory of state formation, accepts much of the ecological theory of state formation. He accepts the idea that you have basically these almost magically perfect subregions that are perfect for grazing, for farming, and as a consequence, these places see an explosion of the population. He adds on an element of the mercantile, or you could say trade theory. So he mixes this together, that at the same time as this is happening, these areas are penetrated by commodities in the form of luxury goods, these beads. And so now you have an aristocracy hooked on these beads. And then he adds the element that to meet this desire for the that to meet the aristocracy's desire for these luxury goods, the elders and the aristocracy tighten control over labor through the person of the chief, creating what you think of as the proto-regiments. So people have to go out and actually hunt the elephants. You remember in my episode on the Tembe, I talked about how some of the problem with the Europeans was that they didn't come consistently. And so you couldn't undertake a systematic attempt to seize ivory. But it slowly started to happen because people desired more and more of these beads. And if you had these luxury goods, beads and cloth, you were able to attract more followers. And so you do have proto-regiments forming, people who look to the chief for their advancement, although they are not the crystallized form we see later on. And then at the turn of the 18th century, two things happen. First, you have the exogenous shock of the Madlatula famine. The famine hits and it absolutely decimates the population. The decimation of the population meant first you had less labor for grazing and farming, but it also means you have less labor for staffing your regiments. There's also the added element of the transformation of the trade pattern at Delagoa Bay. Remember, the whalers re-victualling in Delagoa Bay no longer want ivory, they want cattle. And so now you also need people so that you can go raid the cattle. And so these twin pressures drive the chief to even more harshly centralize power. And of course, this had already been happening because of the trade in ivory anyways. And so this is the final blow that the most powerful chiefs strike against the aristocracy. They finally sever the ideological bonds that the young men had with their elders in the homestead. And then one way we can see that this is actually happening is that around this period, you start to see the cessation of the ritual of circumcision, because circumcision was how a young man became an adult in these societies. And by stopping circumcision, the elders and the chief in this case could monopolize their labor for longer. You will also see in Zululand, it happens in other areas but to a lesser extent, where Shaka depresses the price of lobola. And by doing that, or rather he is doing that in reaction to the scarcity of cattle, because again, they're selling cattle in Delagoa Bay. And so he also uses this process to reward his own men. And so what you actually see is these ecological and trade patterns playing a role in this, but these would not crystallize into state formation were it not for the Madlatula famine. The exigencies caused by the Madlatula famine forced the most forceful and innovative chiefs to tighten their control over labor and resources. And by so doing, it causes a centralization in these states. And once they're centralized and fighting over these ecological zones, it forces them to centralize even more. If you have more regiments, better trained regiments, you're likely to win. And so in that way, we have the emergence of states, because ultimately the states are the result of a centralization process. You now have a standing army, you have a tax system, what we can think of as a tributary system, but a tax system of sorts. You have the ideological underpinnings of a state. And so you have all the elements of a state. This is how state formation happens in the Northern Nguni. I think it is a wonderful theory. And I haven't done it justice. So anyone who's interested in the theory, get Bonner's Kings, Commoners, and Concessionaires and just read chapter 2. You will know more about the state formation in Northern Zululand than 99% of the population. All right. In the next episode, we'll get back to the narrative. And I hope now that you understand the processes that are leading to state formation, I won't have to explain how this is happening in Swaziland, because you'll see how the narrative fills in the sort of latest work we've already created. Thank you for tuning in. Like, subscribe. Thank you.